Well, I grew up an Air Force brat. That's what I usually tell people to begin with. Both my parents were from Greenville, South Carolina, but I grew up with my father in the Air Force, and he was a career man, and for 20 years we moved around a lot. I always try to take that as a positive experience because of meet different people, go see different places and all of that. And I was even born in North Carolina at another military base. And I have one brother, and he was born 4.5 years later than me at yet another Air Force base. Years later, after I had pursued an acting career, after training for it, then I went to UNC Greensboro and decided that what I really wanted to do was really why I wanted to act to begin with. I wanted to tell stories that help people think about being peaceable, nonviolent, not hurt each other. How could we think about ways to be together? So anyway, that was growing up, went to UNC Greensboro and took that whole peace and nonviolence perspective in, studied rhetoric and composition and pedagogy and how to analyze people's writing and discourse on my own and look at speeches and you name it and think, well, what about that might be a violent story or a nonviolent story or might lead to one? Then eventually, finally, I retired, which was a happy moment. I mean, everybody who's worked a long time, and maybe in academia is a field where everybody's like, okay, I'm done here. And now I try to do nonviolence and peacemaking work when an opportunity arises, when there's a nonprofit trying to do something that lends itself to that. And besides the fact that I married a Vietnam veteran, then there's that whole piece of work too. Tom joined the Army, and he arrived in Vietnam in 1968. I was 14 years old. He was 18 years old. Of course, we'd never met then. And I was living on an Air Force base in Florida. So 35 years later, we meet at Western Carolina University. And we recently celebrated our 20th anniversary. We're just tickled to be together. And part of the path was that, you see this really played out in the writing that Tom has done, but we worked through how could he be a hawk and I could be a dove in all manner and get along, much less marry, much less, want to live together forever. When September 11th happened, when we talked about that, that was a really, really strong test, I guess you want to say, for how we were going to go about this. And during that time period, Tom talked about history and wars and military. And I talked about violence, nonviolence, and peace. So there wasn't a lot of common ground there, but what there was a lot of listening. And also we really liked each other, wanted to be together. So you're like, okay, As we spend a few more years together, sharing the same bed, same house, he starts sharing with me some of his most troubling experiences in Vietnam. And because we were living together, I was realizing he was not sleeping well, or he was waking up with nightmares, or news affected him differently than it did me. It really became a real learning experience for me. And he would have times of anger. At one point, I told him he would only get so many times he could complain, bellow loudly at vehicles on the road with us, because it was just troubling to me. Like, how can you be this angry at human beings who are just on the same road with you? I mean, they're just trying to get there, But he was wrecked about it. Well, then I learned about things, I guess, kind of connected to PTSD. I remember one time at a Western football game when fireworks were going off. And that put him in a freaked out position, So I've learned, as the woman who loves him, to pay attention to those kinds of things and understand more about what war really is. He had learned about this idea of writing for healing that was coming out of the VA, and I was like, yeah, that sounds great, try that. And so he did, and then he he said, well, am I supposed to have a certain process for this? And it was kind of neat. I was talking to this grown man who I love and adore, and it's like students in my, first year composition course going, what? But Tom, it was a little bit different questions, but he still wanted to know, what are there some rules here I need to know about, or how should I start this out? And I just said, you're going to figure out the process as you go. You just start writing. So then he wanted me to read some of his stuff. And the first time he wanted to read it out loud. And I really like that about a writer who is willing and wants to read it out loud, see how it goes. And that was just really touching, moving. And I was like, yeah. Then he wanted me to get more serious. And you always want somebody, well, if you've got any sense, if you want to, you always get somebody to read it and give you more feedback, and you're writing in the margins and stuff. So, well, I was given feedback not just on, make this correction or, try that word or whatever, but I was also given feedback about, I don't know if your readers will understand this, or this confused me, and maybe you would want to reword that. Well, you would have thought, I don't know, he was Edgar Allan Poe or somebody, and he's like, excuse me, I'm not changing my words, that's what it is, I said, well, that's fine if you want to leave it that way, but I don't think people are going to understand what you mean. And then you realize his books are it's about war. It's about his experience in the military. So he does use a lot of jargon, but it was just, don't confuse him. Anyway, so we really developed this relationship as writer and reader, and then he was a veteran and I'm a professor, and we're figuring out how to bring our interests and abilities together, and we were husband and wife, and all that we did coming along really made it such a joyful marriage. It's how we could be honking up. My parents lived long enough for them to know Tom and me as a couple. They get to know Tom. They think he's the bee's knees. They have never liked any male person I ever had anything to do with. But also what was really precious was he and my dad could go off and sit over here and talk. And he told things to my dad. My dad's never told us. But also he probably told things that, it's just maybe kind of common, but we still don't know it. So Tom was able to tell me things, and then he'd tell my brother things, well, this is what your dad actually did, or this is what he said about that experience. And I would have never known. And then it started to open up a whole new way of me to think about my mother. What I do remember growing up on those Air Force bases was that, and I guess my mom mostly drilled us, but everybody in that military person's family had to be on their toes. I was told what I could by them. My mom, you can and cannot do this. You cannot get in trouble this way. You cannot, you can't wear that. All of that. And then later I began to piece together. Well, I can remember, for instance, she talked about the wife of one husband, and she had caused some scene and gotten drunk in public and and it was all over the base. It's like, this woman has really, really messed up her family, her husband's career, there's risks here, So when you learn things like that, Now I look back at pictures of my mom and how she had to go to the officers' wives' bridge club, and the officers' wives, and look at how they dressed and all that. And I thought, my mom grew up in Greenville. She was always very embarrassed she did not finish her high school education. She was very, worried about how that would come out. She had to face a lot of expectations. So no wonder she was hard on me. But the deal is that Tom, from beginning on, helped me gain a perspective.
that I am in an actual body of knowledge that has helped me understand more about why life was what it was with my parents. There's alcoholism. There was physical abuse. There was my brother and me not knowing what was going on, or why all of a sudden we were going out of town, or why all of a sudden, why were they yelling at each other again? Only if I understand what it meant to be a military family have I been able to come to any terms about that. Even though I weep when I'm telling you about it. Tom was there when my dad passed. He was there when my mom passed. My mom was one of those people who begged for cigarettes on her dying bed in the hospital. And Tom said if he had it to do over again, he would pick her up and take her outside that hospital so she could have that cigarette. But that was how tight they got. I thank Tom Baker for asking me to marry him.